Move him to a different room. Someone arriving in a jacket like that didn't book the Birchwood suite. That's simply not how it works. The woman who said it did not lower her voice. She stood at the far end of the front desk at Harrogate Lodge, with her hand resting on a leather travel case, speaking to the duty manager as though the man she was describing were not 10 feet away and could hear every word. Barrett Holden heard every word. He was crouching beside his 9-year-old daughter, Prue, helping her re-zip the front pocket of her worn canvas backpack, where she kept her colored pencils and the small spiral notebook she carried everywhere. The pencils kept slipping loose. She had already filled 2 pages with dock sketches since they arrived. The railing, the waterline, a heron she had spotted near the far shore, and she was not yet done. Barrett, 39 years old, wore a faded dark green fleece jacket over a plain gray shirt. The kind of jacket that had been washed so many times the color had gentled into something barely distinguishable from the surrounding light. His boots were dry but scuffed along the toes. He had driven 4 hours north from Guelph that morning with Prue in the passenger seat, a thermos of coffee between them, the radio off. The two of them quiet in the way that people are when they have been a pair long enough to know when silence is preferable to sound. They were here because of Rebecca. Rebecca Holden had died 27 months ago in late February from an illness that had moved faster than any of the people who loved her were prepared for. She had spoken about Harrogate Lodge the way some people speak about places they've never been but feel they already know, with a particular and sensory longing that was not quite hope and not quite memory. She had read about the Birchwood suite in a magazine and kept the page folded in the drawer beside her bed. She had said, on more than one occasion, next summer, maybe when Prue is a little older and can appreciate the lake properly. Barrett had made the reservation 9 months after the funeral. He had booked the suite, the one in the photograph, the one with the private cedar porch that stepped directly down to the water, because he wanted Prue to stand inside it, not to make grief smaller, but to show her that certain things her mother had loved continued to exist and could still be walked into and touched. The reservation had been confirmed without difficulty. A young staff member named Tobias had processed the booking at check-in, handed over 2 keycard envelopes, and asked whether they needed help with the bags. Barrett had thanked him and said they were fine. They were 10 feet from the hallway leading to the lakeside cabins when Portia Ashfield arrived. Portia Crane Ashfield entered Harrogate Lodge, the way people enter rooms when they have spent their lives arriving ahead of other people in the order of attention. She wore a pale camel blazer over a dark silk blouse, and the luggage her assistant carried behind her was the kind with brushed leather trim and recessed zippers, the kind sold in boutiques with very few items visible and no price listed on any of them. She was the chief executive of Ardent Retail Group, a national chain headquartered in Calgary with offices in Toronto and Vancouver, and she had been bringing corporate groups to Harrogate Lodge every autumn for 6 consecutive years. The lodge's duty manager knew her name before she reached the desk. Kent Larimer stepped forward. He greeted Portia warmly, asked about the drive up from the city, confirmed her reservation. Then she asked about the Birchwood suite. Kent paused just long enough for Portia to notice. She had included a request for the suite in her correspondence with the reservation department weeks earlier. The request had never been formally approved. The suite was, at that point, already booked under another name, but the word request had passed through 2 staff members and arrived in Portia's itinerary as something indistinguishable from a confirmation. Kent explained that the Birchwood suite was currently occupied. Portia looked past him toward the hallway, where Barrett and Prue were still standing, Prue now pressing one hand against the lobby window to watch a pair of ducks moving along the dock below. "Move him to a different room," Portia said. "Someone arriving in a jacket like that didn't book the Birchwood suite. That's simply not how it works." Prue turned from the window. She was 9 years old, dark-eyed, and possessed of the particular attentiveness of a child who has spent 2 years learning to read the emotional temperature of every room her father walked into. She looked at Portia, then at the desk, then at the back of her father's head. She pulled the backpack closer against her chest. Barrett stood slowly. He had heard everything. His expression when he turned was composed in the way of someone who decided how to respond before the situation finished presenting itself. He produced the keycard envelope from his jacket pocket and set it on the counter. "Our reservation was confirmed in February," he said. "Birchwood suite, 2 nights. The name is Holden." Kent looked at the envelope. He looked at Portia. He looked at the envelope again. He was not a dishonest man by instinct, but he was a man who had learned to calculate which relationships the property needed to protect, and the Ardent Retail Group represented 12 corporate bookings a year. a number that appeared in Lakeward Properties' quarterly projections specifically flagged as a priority account. "Mr. Holden," Kent said, lowering his voice in the way meant to signal discretion, but usually signaling only discomfort. "I apologize for any confusion. There appears to have been a system issue with the suite allocation. We'd be delighted to offer you one of our premier waterfront rooms. Comparable view, full amenities." "There was no system issue," Barrett said. "The suite was booked and confirmed in February." Portia's assistant set down the leather luggage and took a small step back. A couple sitting near the stone fireplace pretended to study the lodge's activity brochure. A man near the window straightened slightly, watching. An older woman descending from the upper landing paused on the staircase, one hand on the rail. "My company has brought considerable business to this property," Portia said, addressing Kent rather than Barrett, as though Barrett's presence were a variable to be managed rather than a person to be spoken to. "I have certain expectations when I arrive, and those expectations were communicated well in advance." "They were requested," Barrett said quietly. "Not confirmed. Those are different things." Portia looked at him directly for the first time. She took in the fleece jacket, the scuffed boots, the worn backpack against Prue's chest. Her expression was not angry so much as impatient, the impatience of someone accustomed to situations resolving on their preferred schedule. "Sir," she said, "there's no reason to make this unpleasant. I'm sure the room they're offering is lovely. It would probably suit you better anyway." Prue reached over and took hold of the hem of her father's jacket. She didn't say anything. She had gone very still in the way she went still when a situation moved past her understanding of what was fair. Her knuckles had gone pale against the fabric, and when Barrett looked down at her, her eyes were too bright, the way they were when she was working very hard not to cry in front of strangers. He crouched to her level. "It's all right," he said quietly. She whispered, "Did we do something wrong?" The lobby went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with volume. The couple at the fireplace had stopped pretending to read the brochure. The man near the window was not looking away. The woman on the staircase had not moved. Barrett held his daughter's gaze for a moment. "No," he said, "we didn't do anything wrong." He straightened and looked at Kent. "I won't be relocating to another room. If the lodge intends to reassign a confirmed booking without my consent, I'd like that decision documented in writing, with the operational reasons stated, and I'd like the name of whoever authorized it." Kent's expression shifted in a way that was not quite discomfort and not quite recognition, something between them. "Mr. Holden, I can assure you the lodge values your—" "In writing," Barrett said again. He picked up Prue's backpack and held it in one hand. With the other, he took her hand. What followed was not a confrontation. It was quieter than that and in some ways worse. Kent made a phone call. A second staff member appeared, spoke with him briefly in a low voice, then disappeared again. Portia waited at the far end of the lobby with the patience of someone who has never had to wait for very long. When Kent returned, he offered Barrett a full suite upgrade credit for a future visit, complimentary dinner, and the lodge's premier waterfront room for the current stay. He delivered the offer in the tone of a man who had rehearsed the phrasing and was relieved to be saying it. Barrett asked again for the written documentation. Kent said lodge policy didn't require written notation for accommodation adjustments. Barrett looked at him without raising his voice, without moving. He said what was happening was not an adjustment. It was the removal of a child and her father from a room they had legally reserved, at the request of another guest, with no documented reason. Decisions of that kind had records, and he was asking for one. Kent said the paperwork would require time they didn't currently have. He said it with an apology in his voice, which made it feel smaller. Barrett did not argue further. He looked at the desk placard. He looked at Kent's name tag. He looked at Tobias, still standing near the key management cabinet, and asked him what time the duty manager's shift ended. Tobias opened his mouth, looked at Kent, and then, very quietly, said 7 o'clock. Barrett nodded. He took Prue's hand and followed the second staff member down the hall to the waterfront room. The room was beautiful. The view across the lake was wide and still, the water going silver in the late afternoon light. But it was not the suite in the photograph, and Prue knew it without being told. She sat on the edge of the bed and opened her notebook, staring at the half-finished heron she'd started on the dock. After a while, she said, "Why didn't you tell them?" Barrett pulled the desk chair over and sat across from her. Through the window, the dock extended over dark water, and the far shore was going orange at the tree line. He thought, not for the first time, about the way Rebecca had described this lake, the specific quality of quiet she had imagined it would have. "Because if they'd treated us with respect only after learning something about me," he said. Then they wouldn't actually be treating us with respect. They'd be treating a title with respect. That's a different thing entirely. Prue was quiet for a moment, looking at the lake. Mum would have been really angry, she said. Barrett smiled, just slightly. Your mum would have been absolutely furious, he agreed. That evening, he ordered room service. He helped Prue finish her drawing. He read beside her until she fell asleep, with the notebook still open on her chest, and then he sat by the window in the dark and thought through the afternoon with the quiet, unhurried precision he had once applied to every financial model he had ever built. He had noticed three things during the sequence of events. First, that Kent had looked at Portia's request documentation before looking at Barrett's booking confirmation, and the order of that had mattered to the outcome. Second, that Kent had made a specific internal call before returning with his offer, meaning the decision had been approved above his level. Third, that the lodge's key management screen, visible from the desk, had shown the suite allocation already updated before Barrett had agreed to anything. Those were not the details of a man who had simply been inconvenienced. They were the details of a record that had been changed. The following morning, a knock came at the door before 8. It was Tobias. He stood in the hallway with his hands in his jacket pockets, clearly uncertain whether he had made the right decision coming, and explained that he had been present at the desk when the suite allocation was changed in the system. He said Kent had entered the modification before recording any reason for it. He said Portia's assistant had spoken with Kent privately for about 4 minutes beforehand, and that during that conversation the assistant had mentioned specifically that the Ardent retail account was coming up for its annual renewal. Tobias took out his phone. He had photographed the reservation screen during check-in, a habit he had developed because the lodge's system occasionally lost data during server updates, and he used the images to verify bookings if questions arose. The first photograph, time-stamped at 2:47 the previous afternoon, showed the Birchwood suite assigned to B. Holden. A second photograph, taken 50 minutes later, showed a different name in that field. Barrett looked at both images. He looked at Tobias. "You could have kept this to yourself," he said. Tobias looked slightly uncomfortable in the way of a young person who has made a decision they know is right but are still slightly afraid of. "Yeah," he said, "but you had your daughter with you, and the reason she gave for moving you, it was your jacket." Rupert Gaines arrived at Harrogate Lodge mid-morning on the second day. He was the regional vice president of Lakeward Properties, the hospitality group that owned Harrogate Lodge, and he had been scheduled for a quarterly property review that weekend. He had arrived accompanied by the lodge's general manager, who had flown up from Toronto the previous evening after a flag appeared in the property's booking system, a modification to a confirmed reservation with no recorded operational reason attached. Rupert moved through the lobby the way people move when they have spent years learning to assess properties by the texture of their surfaces. He was mid-sentence with the general manager when he saw Barrett crossing the lobby with Prue, heading toward the dock with a thermos and the canvas backpack. He stopped walking. He had met Barrett Holden 3 times in private settings during the early years of Lakeward Properties formation. He knew the face. He knew the particular economy of movement. He also knew that Barrett Holden had provided the capital that made Harrogate Lodge's full renovation possible. The building of the lakeside cabins, the restoration of the main structure, the private dock, and had insisted from the beginning that his name appear nowhere on the property's marketing materials, signage, or public-facing documents. "Barrett," he said. Barrett turned. He recognized Rupert without surprise. He waited. Rupert crossed the lobby. The general manager followed. Behind the front desk, Kent had just arrived for his morning shift, jacket half removed when he heard the name and went still. "Why are you in a waterfront room?" Rupert asked. Barrett looked briefly at Prue, who had glanced up at the exchange. "She's going to finish her drawing on the dock," he said. "Give me a few minutes." Prue looked at her father. He crouched down and straightened the zip on the front pocket of her backpack. "The heron isn't done yet," he said. "Go finish him. I'll be right out." She went. At the door she looked back once. Then she walked out into the morning light. Barrett stood and told Rupert what had happened. Quietly, without embellishment, the confirmed reservation, the request that had never been formally approved, Kent's phone call before the offer was made, the updated suite record, the absence of any written documentation despite 3 separate requests for it, the basis on which the decision appeared to have been made. He asked for the booking record to be locked before anything else was modified. Rupert made the call immediately. The general manager spoke to Kent, who stood at the side of the desk with the expression of a man looking for an exit that doesn't exist. Kent confirmed that he had authorized the reassignment. He said the ardent retail account was an important relationship. He said he had assumed the matter would settle quietly. Rupert asked whether he had reviewed Barrett's confirmation before making the decision. Kent said he had seen it. Rupert asked why he had overridden it. Kent could not produce a reason that survived the asking. Tobias provided his photographs to Rupert and the general manager. The timestamp sequence was unambiguous. The record had been changed. It had been changed without consent, without documentation, and without any reason that had anything to do with an operational need. Portia Ashfield opened the door to the Birchwood suite when the general manager knocked and found Rupert, the general manager, and Barrett standing in the cedar-lined hallway outside. She recognized Rupert and extended her hand. He did not take it. He told her, briefly, that the suite had been occupied under a confirmed reservation when she arrived, that the decision to reassign the prior guest had been made without justification, and that the lodge was correcting the booking to its original assignment. Portia looked at Barrett. She looked at his jacket. She looked back at Rupert. "I've been bringing business to this property for 6 years," she said. "I'm aware," Rupert said. "That relationship will be reviewed in light of what occurred yesterday." The general manager said, "Mrs. Ashfield, the guest your request displaced is Barrett Holden. He is a founding financial partner of Lakeward Properties and provided the capital for this lodge's full renovation. He has held that position for 7 years and has never once used it to request preferential treatment or priority access." Portia went very still. She looked at Barrett again, really looked in the way she had not looked the day before, trying to reconcile the worn jacket and the canvas backpack and the child on the dock with the information she had just received. The reconciliation was not going smoothly. Barrett met her gaze. "I wasn't keeping it from you to embarrass you later," he said. "I kept it from you because I wanted to see how you would treat a man in a faded jacket with a 9-year-old daughter who had nowhere else to be. Now I know." Portia said nothing. Barrett looked at the suite key in her hand, then at Rupert. "The record needs to be corrected," he said, "and I'd like to understand how far back the pattern goes." It went back further than the previous afternoon. Rachel, no, the general manager, working with Rupert and the lodge's compliance team, reviewed Kent's authorization history across the past 14 months. 4 earlier incidents emerged in which individual guest reservations had been quietly downgraded during periods of high corporate demand. In 2 of those cases, families had been moved without written consent or documented reason. In all 4, the reassigned guests had been offered small compensatory gestures, and the incidents had been filed as resolved without formal review. The guests had not known they could ask for documentation. Most people didn't know to ask. Kent was suspended from duty pending a full investigation. The Ardent Retail account was placed under formal review by Lakeward Properties head office. Portia Ashfield departed Harrogate Lodge that afternoon. Her assistant loaded the leather luggage into the same vehicle that had brought them north. Tobias was formally recognized by the general manager and by Rupert for preserving the evidence and coming forward at personal professional risk. Barrett wrote him a recommendation for Lakeward's regional leadership training program, noting that the decision to speak truthfully when silence was available was rarer than any credential listed on a resume. Before leaving, Barrett met with Rupert and the general manager and set out 3 changes he wanted in place across all Lakeward properties. No confirmed reservation was to be reassigned to accommodate a different guest without the original guest's written consent and a documented operational reason that had nothing to do with the commercial value of the incoming party. Any reassignment involving a child required sign-off from a senior manager recorded by name. Complaints about accommodation decisions were to be reviewed by a channel independent of the management team that made the original call. He also asked that Lakeward begin a program of unannounced visits by senior personnel traveling as ordinary guests, without advance notice, so that the company's leadership would have regular, unmediated experience of what it felt like to arrive at one of their properties without a name that preceded them. On the last morning, Barrett and Prue were on the dock before the light had properly cleared the tree line across the water. Prue had finished the heron and started a 3rd drawing, the dock itself, extending over the lake, the morning sky above it going pale orange and then gray. The general manager came down to the dock to hand Barrett the Birchwood suite key for one final complimentary night, and to apologize in person for what had happened to them. Barrett thanked her. He held the key for a moment, looking across the grounds toward the guest parking area. A young couple was unloading a small sedan near the entrance, a toddler on the father's hip, A woman moving slowly and carefully, the way people move when they are recovering from something medical. They were checking something on a phone, with the concentrated expression of people who are not entirely sure the booking will be what they were promised. Barrett held the keycard out to the general manager. "Give it to them," he said. "Whatever room they've got, upgrade them to the suite. Don't explain why, just do it." She looked at him. "Prue and I have what we came for," he said. He looked at his daughter, who was still drawing, pencil moving in small, careful arcs around the shape of the dock railing. Her mother wanted her to see this lake. She's seen it. That's enough. They drove south out of Muskoka an hour later, the highway unspooled between stands of birch and spruce, the light going white, and even as the morning settled in. Prue fell asleep against the window before they reached the highway junction, her notebook open on her knees to the finished drawing. Heron, dock, water, that thin orange line of morning above the far shore. Barrett drove in silence. He had not told Prue who had built the place. He had not told her what had been taken from them, or what he had set in motion afterward. She would understand it in time, the way children understand difficult things. Not all at once, but in pieces, through the accumulation of small and careful moments that show them what the person beside them believed was worth protecting. What he had wanted her to see was not the moment power reveals itself. He had wanted her to see the decision that comes before that, the one a person makes alone, before anyone is watching, when the easier thing and the right thing are pointing in different directions. The decision to stay decent in a room full of people who have decided you're worth less than the woman in the camel blazer. Not because it's easy, not because it will be recognized, but because some things, once surrendered, are very difficult to recover. The birches thinned, Muskoka fell away behind them. Prue slept. Her notebook rose and fell with her breathing, the heron still visible on the open page, finished at last in pencil lines so careful and deliberate they looked almost like something her mother might have kept.